All right, let me hit slideshow here. We'll get started. So today we're looking at America's first form of government. And if that sounds like a weird sentence to you, it's news maybe to you that we had one form of government before our current form of government. And this is what I like to call the rough draft of American government. So it's called the Articles of Confederation. So we'll find out why it doesn't currently exist, which means that some things went wrong to have it be replaced. So we get some standards there. I'm just going to skip right over. Some questions that we'll kind of address in this. So these aren't necessarily questions that you're going to see on the quiz, but what is a constitution? What is government? And how is the American government organized? That question, what is government, is actually like a question that we obviously study in civics. But it's a question that people are asking in America in this time period that we're talking about. So people are saying, why do we need government? We just fought a war against a type of government. So what do we need now that's going to help us out? And then the last question here is our current form of government the way it's always been? And as I just said, with this being our rough draft, no. So skipping right along our video here. In this time period, shortly after the revolution, right, we've formed a new country here. States are writing their own constitutions. And that means that, like, North Carolina's got some different laws than Virginia, and Virginia's got different laws than Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's got different laws than Massachusetts. You get the point. Some states are writing in there, like Massachusetts, for example, that there should be no slavery. And so there's a lot of small differences between state constitutions, and then there's some also pretty big ones, like the question of slavery. We also have in our state governments a lot of the weak executive, and we have meaning that there is a governor, but the governor is not a super powerful individual. And then the idea that there's separation of powers, so that there is going to be an executive, a legislative, and a judicial branch, and that all three of those branches' jobs is to make sure one branch doesn't get too powerful. That is something that should sound familiar to you from civics, and also just that's our government today. Federal, state, even in some areas, local government is like that. So a term here that is really important to know is republic, and that is a state where power, and I say state here, this could be government, where power is held by the citizens, entitled to vote, and is exercised by the representatives that they select. So it's not an absolute democracy like you might see in ancient Greece, where everyone who's a citizen shows up to vote on an issue on a given day. In fact, in ancient Greece, they did that. People could suggest topics to vote on, and then everyone would show up and vote. Worth pointing out that not everyone in Greece was a citizen. There were people that didn't own land that weren't able to vote, and there were slaves that weren't able to vote. And so that also is a parallel here with American history. But a republic and a democracy are not quite opposite ideas, but they're not exactly the same. And so when we talk about republics, we're talking about people voting in representatives to vote for them for things. When we talk about democracy, we're talking about people voting on issues. And so what we have in this country now is what's called a Republican democracy, which is, or a democratic republic, however you want to flip those words around, where people vote, and we allow more people to vote than we did back then on certain issues, yes, but also people get to vote on their elected officials. And so their elected officials go to Washington, D.C., or their elected officials go to Raleigh, North Carolina, and they create legislation. And so there is a democratic element to our republic even today. I really like you guys to understand this term, because if you say the pledge every day, you're saying this word republic every day. And it just kind of boggles my mind that people would say something every day and not even know what the word means. So, and to the republic for which it stands, now you have an idea of what a republic is. There are guaranteed certain rights in states, such as freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom of speech, and equality in voting rights. Notice there in parentheses, for some people. Okay, not everyone had voting rights, as I've mentioned already, and I've mentioned in previous episodes. So freedom of religion, that really comes from Voltaire. If you guys go back to civics and you learn about, French Enlightenment philosophers, Voltaire is really big on this idea that, even if you're Christian or you're Jewish or you're Muslim, you shouldn't necessarily create laws that inhibit other people's freedom of religion. And there's going to be huge debates around freedom of religion the more we go into American history. such as modern debates like, should we have under God on our currency, or should we say one nation under God in the Pledge of Allegiance? Those kinds of questions that people tend to kind of not really spend too much time questioning. But also things like, should tax dollars go to private schools that are Christian or religious based? Those are serious questions, and questions that we've had in the last 50 years. And some people have said, yes, they're schools, they need tax money. And other people have said, well, you're forcing everyone in an area to pay taxes to a specific religion. So that might call into question that freedom of religion. Freedom of press is going to come from a case back in the 1600s where the guy named John Peter Zenger, he was writing a bunch of articles about a bunch of dudes. And one colonial governor, not somebody who was elected by the people, but somebody appointed by the king, basically locked him up for stuff that he was saying. Now, the stuff he was writing was critical of that governor, but the stuff he was writing was also true. And so the governor basically said, look, you're writing about stuff that is deeply personal about me, so you're going to spend some time in prison. And this guy was like, this is absolutely baloney. I should be able to write what I want, especially because it's true. And so that case kind of is, I don't want to say it's fresh in the memory of these people, but writing these state constitutions, but it's something that people are very aware of and people are very concerned about if our government were to just lock up journalists for writing things that were critical about them. Or if our government were to say, like, smash TV cameras or something like that to promote this idea that the press are bad or the press are a nuisance, right? Whether you like watching the news or not, or whether you like the media or not, the moment we start taking away those freedoms is the moment that the government gets away with a lot more. So the freedom of press is built in there. So A, people can speak their mind in the newspaper, and B, the journalists can cover things that the politicians are doing to present that information to the people. So we have more informed decisions when we vote for who we're voting for. Speech, I don't want to talk about this one too much, but freedom of speech is an important right, and states were guaranteeing that right. And then voting rights we've talked about already. We'll kind of talk about that more and how that changes throughout the course. So there are 13 states that function independently. There is an overarching document that unifies all these states. There's like several dozen analogies I could go with here, but think about like a patchwork quilt, except instead of like really neatly stitched together, like really tight, and you can cuddle with this patchwork quilt when it's cold outside. This is like more of a patchwork quilt where every state is like kind of just like single threaded to each other. We're looking at a time where different states had different currencies. And so traveling from North Carolina to South Carolina or South Carolina to Georgia, you might have to exchange currencies just to be able to buy stuff in that state. So the Articles of Confederation, it's ratified in 1781. That if that date seems odd to you, it's actually because that's prior to the signing of the Treaty of Paris of 1783. But again, as I mentioned in the previous episode, like signing a treaty between the United States and Britain did take some time, and America didn't want to wait until that treaty was signed before they started government, right? If you're a new country and people start hearing about like, oh, this country doesn't actually have any laws yet, then you're kind of encouraging anarchy to happen really quick. So it is signed in 1781, prior to the signing of the Treaty of Paris. The major points here with the Articles of Confederation is it only introduces one branch of government, and that branch is Congress. So there's no Supreme Court and there is no presidency. This Congress could declare war, sign treaties, borrow money, coin money, establish postal service, and enter treaties with Native Americans. So those are things that when we study the Constitution will kind of sound familiar to you. Another thing here worth pointing out is that each state had one vote in Congress. So there's essentially 13 members of Congress in this Articles of Confederation. Now, 13 is a nice number because it's odd, and that means there's not going to be any ties. But 13 people basically to run a country is maybe not as many people as we might like. Currently, we have 100 people in the Senate, and we have 435 people in the House of Representatives. So in our current version of Congress, we have 535 plus the 3 delegates from, that's for our electoral college. But we have a member from DC that is also included in that. And so our 535 members today greatly outnumbers the 13 at this time. I could mention tangentially that 13 for the population back then is, if we were to adjust our proportion today, we would probably be looking at more than 535 members of the House of Representatives. But we've kind of locked in one representative equals a set number of people in a state. So what you can do basically is take the U.S. population and divide it by that number 535, find out how many delegates or how many people represent each delegate. I don't want to do this math on this video because I'm going to make so many mistakes. But essentially, one delegate or one representative today is worth way more than one representative back then, just because the population changed. So there's questions about the Western land. And this has kind of been a question since our first section, our first unit, where we had American colonists moving into that French territory with the Courrier de Bois and your Native Americans. At this time, the Western lands is part of the federal government. But the federal government is basically saying, look, we don't know what to do with this land. So what do we do? How do we make new states out of it? How do we divide it? How do we get people to settle it? And all those kinds of things. So the Articles of Confederation is going to address one important question. It's not really great for anything else, but it is going to look at this land you see here on the map, this Western territory, which we now consider parts of the Deep South and parts of Appalachia and parts of the Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and that top part of Minnesota up here, if I get my little fun mouse pointer right there, Minnesota. So those parts of the new territory are going to be tried to be divvied up here with this land ordinance of 1785. What this establishes is people to go out west and survey the land. We don't have perfect maps at this time in American history, and these people are going out there to try and figure out where are there rivers, where are there, mountains and hills and all kinds of stuff, geographic features. Other major success of the Articles of Confederation here is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, and this establishes rules for those that Northwest Territory, which is this stuff up here. It establishes rules for those, including, this is kind of a big one early on, it bans slavery in that territory. And so this is really, the Northwest Ordinance is really considered the only success of the Articles of Confederation. Because what's going to happen after this is people are going to start to question, like, what happens if we got attacked by Britain again? Would we be strong enough and would we be unified enough to fight off the British? And a lot of people kind of look around and say, I don't think so, because the states are not truly unified or not truly united. So we are the United States of America on paper, but we're more of a collection of states that all kind of want to do their own things in practice. So the Northwest Ordinance has some, kind of key parts here. When the total population, I'll just read this part and move on, reaches 60,000 free inhabitants, not slaves, then the states, the people in that state could write a state constitution, and Congress would be able to basically say that package of land is now going to be a state. And so we do see states like Ohio very quickly come into the United States and be added to our 13 original. I want to say Kentucky might be the first after the original 13, but I don't think that's correct. And I don't have any tabs up right now to correct me on that. Some weaknesses of the articles, okay? Because again, this is going to be where we have to reform it. The federal government cannot tax. And so if you think about, again, Britain trying to launch an attack on the United States, what you'd have to have is the states basically collecting taxes to make a state army or a state militia. Maybe something like you might consider the National Guard today. So that's a big one. When the federal government can't tax, the federal government can't do a lot of things. The federal government also does not or cannot enforce laws. Part of that also relates to the bottom point here, or the bottom 2 points, and that is that realistically, states or the federal government cannot pass laws. It takes 9 out of 13 states to agree to stuff. And if you look at the breakup or the makeup of the United States, you've got pretty much your like northern states, your middle states, and your southern states. Those states kind of all think in different ways. So northern states typically aren't super crazy about slavery. They're more focused on shipping and merchant class. Your middle colonies are going to be focused on producing food, producing tobacco, and then states in the South have sugar, indigo, rice, and tobacco as well. Southern states are going to be a lot of pro-slavery people down there too. So it's kind of hard to unite people and get people on board. Again, the only law they really passed, or the only two laws they passed, were on the previous slide: the Northwest Ordinance and the Land Ordinance. So in several years of this form of government, there's only two laws passed. And that shows you, again, that is very ineffective. And also states are kind of happy to play this game and say, look, the federal government really doesn't exist. It does on paper, but it doesn't really in practice. There is no court system. There is no respect abroad. France is kind of like disappointed in us because they're like, dude, we helped you guys out so much. What are you doing? And we're kind of like, oh, well, we've got this Articles of Confederation. And France is like, but that's not going to help you against Britain if they come back and fight you. And so it's hard for the United States to build credit around the world. It's hard for us to trade with other countries because people don't think we're an actual country yet. Britain certainly doesn't think that, even though there is a treaty saying that. The mindset of King George is that eventually this whole American experiment is going to fail, and then the colonies are going to want to join back up with Britain. And that doesn't happen, spoiler alert. But they can't change laws either. So once a law is in place, once you get 9 out of 13 states to agree to a law, it has to be unanimous, 13 out of 13, to change the law. So the Land Ordinance and the Northwest Ordinance are stuck, and southern states that say, wait a second, you just banned slavery. What's the thinking there? They can't change these laws. So the states are in conflict. There's different money, as I mentioned. There's trade disputes. There's war debts. Some states have paid off their war debt. Other states haven't. And the federal government is not doing a good job of keeping tabs on that. And so what really prompts change here? What's the big catalyst, the big turning point within this Articles of Confederation time period in American history is led by a guy named Daniel Shays. Daniel Shays is a Western Massachusetts farmer. So we might think of Massachusetts as like all Boston, but realistically, there's a lot of farmland out west. And those Western farmers are like, they fought in the Revolutionary War. They're not John Adams. They're not Sam Adams. They're not wealthy. But they're in Massachusetts. They were happy to fight for the revolution, fight for independence. And they did that. And then the state of Massachusetts said, hey, guys, we're going to need to raise taxes to pay off our war debts. And Daniel Shays says, well, hang on a second. Why do I have war debts when I fought for this country? Also, I'm a poor farmer. So like you're asking me to basically to sell my house and sell my farm to pay off a debt where like, I kind of risked my life. And so he's not happy. And there's a bunch of other farmers that also are like totally down with his cause and saying, yes, we are farmers too. We gave our life for this. And now you're taxing us. They also throw in there that like they're in the West and there's not a lot of representatives. There's not a lot of people in government in Boston from western part of Pennsylvania. And so they dust off that old slogan, no taxation without representation, because they're being taxed for a war that they fought in, but they're not really able to change those taxes. They're not really able to get somebody in government that they think can change that for them. So they do a rebellion. They just take up their arms, the same rifles they fought against the British with, and they're marching into places like Boston and major cities to say, look, you can't raise taxes on us, drop it, and then we'll go home. And so this really kind of freaks out a lot of states because there's a huge concern that Daniel Shays Rebellion is not just going to stay in Massachusetts, but it's going to spread out. It's going to go into places like New York, and it's going to go into places like Pennsylvania, and then eventually Virginia, and then eventually North Carolina, and all kinds of places, right? And so if there's a rebellion shortly after America does a revolution to form a new country, then there is a question of where does this stop? Where does the revolution end? And where does where does the new government start? So eventually states back down, especially Massachusetts, and it kind of makes everyone question the efficacy and the effectiveness of the Articles of Confederation. So there's a video on Shays Rebellion. I'm going to skip over. Little gravestone here. The last battle of Shays Rebellion was here, February 27th, 1787. And so the assessment questions, I want to go through these really quickly, but if you've watched this whole thing to this point, these are, again, questions that you're likely to see on the quiz. So hopefully you write these questions down on your notes paper. And then if you get to use your notes paper on your quiz, which you might be able to, then you've kind of got these in the bag. So number one, how successful were the Articles of Confederation at uniting the new country? I think if you've listened to any part of this, you would know that that is not effective. The articles, they're not a horrible document. They do allow for some laws to be passed, but they're not really good at uniting the country. Um, Number two, why would the ruling classes come to feel the articles needed to be revised? The biggest reason for that is Daniel Shays, is that the articles made it seem that the states were in power and that the federal government didn't have a lot of power. You could also say the ruling classes might have looked at the articles and said, like, yeah, states really have power here. And if we're trying to push the country forward, then we need a better system. We need a federal government that's able to do things and tax people. Number three, what do the Land Ordinance and Northwest Ordinance tell us about the visions that the Founding Fathers had for their new nation? Realistically, if you look at the map again that we go back to when we talk about this stuff, the Founding Fathers very much expected people to start moving out west and settling this land. And so they wanted to put a plan in place when these territories became big enough, then there would be something to trigger that those places would become states. And so they're thinking people are going to move west, and that happens, right? Some of the bigger states now are in the Midwest. Ohio is a big state. Illinois is a big state today. So, yeah. And then the final question here, what were the fatal flaws of the Articles of Confederation? I mean, the biggest one that you really should know is that the Articles of Confederation could not collect taxes. And again, it's really just like if you were, if you're a person that doesn't have a job and you don't have an income, then you can't buy nice things. The federal government not having a source of income, taxation, means the federal government can't buy nice things like a national army or a national navy or road systems that go throughout different states. So those are all things that are going to be things that people really want in a new country. Now, a lot of people were happy with the states having ultimate power, but again, with 13 states all acting independently, there's going to be more problems with that than successes. So that is the biggest one with the Articles of Confederation is taxation. Of course, there's that whole slide where you go through the problems of the articles. 2 slides here, right? So yeah, cool. Well, that is 1.5 Articles of Confederation, and thank you all for watching. Hope this was